This man won 5 NBA championships, earned $250 million, and still spent his entire career showing up to games in oversized plaid shirts and outdated baggy jeans, while driving the same low-profile SUV he bought years ago. That's Tim Duncan, one of the wealthiest athletes alive, and he has spent decades making absolutely sure you'd never know about his wealth. So why does one of the greatest players in basketball history live like he's still waiting on a paycheck? Let's find out. The millionaire next door, who actually means it. There's a running joke among San Antonio Spurs fans that has been circulating for years and refuses to die because it's too accurate to let go. If you see someone who looks like Tim Duncan standing in the discount aisle of a grocery store, that is actually Tim Duncan. Not someone who resembles him, not a lookalike doing a bit, but the actual 5-time NBA champion, 2-time MVP, first ballot Hall of Famer, personally inspecting the reduced-price items in a San Antonio supermarket, like a man who has a very specific weekly budget and intends to stick to it. Now here's the thing about that joke that makes it interesting rather than just funny. Tim Duncan earned $242 million in NBA salary alone across 19 seasons with the Spurs. And when you fold in his endorsement work with Adidas and other partners, the total figure comfortably clears $250 million. This is not a man who needs to think about grocery prices. This is not a man operating under any financial constraint that would make frugality a necessity rather than a choice. He could, without any meaningful impact on his net worth, eat at the finest restaurants in San Antonio every single night for the rest of his life and barely register the expenditure against what he's accumulated. Instead, he shops for discounts, drives old SUVs, wears clothes that look like they came from the clearance rack at a department store that has since closed, and has essentially disappeared from public life so completely since his 2016 retirement that some people who weren't paying close attention aren't entirely sure he's still alive. He's alive. He's in San Antonio. He's probably working on someone's engine at his custom car shop, and genuinely couldn't care less that you haven't seen him on Instagram lately. Partly because he's not on Instagram, and partly because the concept of needing the world to know what he's doing today has never once appealed to him. To understand why a man with this much money lives this way, you have to start from the very beginning, before the championships and the contracts and the quiet legend status, back when Tim Duncan was a kid in the Virgin Islands who wanted nothing from life except to swim fast enough to go to the Olympics, and the world had other plans entirely. The hurricane, the promise, and the foundation that built everything. Tim Duncan grew up in the Virgin Islands with one dream, and it had nothing to do with basketball. From the age of 5, he was a swimmer, training up to 8,000 meters a day, 6 days a week, following in the footsteps of his older sister Trisha, and genuinely believing that his path led to the Olympics. This wasn't a casual hobby or a childhood phase he was going to grow out of. This was a committed, disciplined athletic pursuit that shaped his entire identity and daily structure before adolescence had finished arriving. Then Hurricane Hugo hit in 1989, destroying the only Olympic standard competition pool on the island, and forcing training into the open ocean, where sharks made the decision to keep swimming feel considerably less appealing. For most kids, that would be a painful setback. For Tim Duncan, it arrived at the same time as something far more devastating, and the combination of the two reshaped the entire direction of his life. He was 14 years old when his mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, and the loss that followed didn't arrive quietly or gradually. It arrived with the specific brutality that terminal illness delivers when it takes a parent from a child who isn't remotely prepared to lose one. In her final moments, his mother didn't ask him to be famous or wealthy or celebrated. She made him promise one thing: that no matter what happened, he would graduate from college. Not win championships, not earn millions, not become the greatest power forward in NBA history. Graduate from college. Keep the promise. That promise, made at a bedside in the Virgin Islands to a dying woman who loved him, became the emotional foundation of everything Tim Duncan subsequently built, and it explains things about him that no financial philosophy or personal branding strategy ever could. When the most important commitment of your life is a promise to a person who is no longer alive to see you keep it, the external signals of success start to feel genuinely weightless by comparison. What does a Rolex mean to a man whose defining motivation is honoring the memory of his mother? What does a mansion communicate that 5 championship rings and a college degree don't already say more clearly? He picked up basketball after the pool was gone, and the grief had settled into something he could carry rather than something that pinned him in place. And he approached the court the way a swimmer approaches water, with patience, with technical precision, and with a complete absence of interest in performing for spectators. He wasn't learning basketball to be watched. He was learning it to be excellent at it, which is a subtle but enormously important distinction that would define his entire career. 19 seasons, 5 rings, and the most unglamorous dynasty in NBA history. When Tim Duncan arrived in San Antonio as the first overall pick in the 1997 NBA draft, the Spurs were a franchise in transition, and Duncan was already, at 21 years old, operating with a maturity that made veteran players do double takes. He had kept his promise to his mother, 4 years at Wake Forest, a degree in psychology, a genuine education rather than a staged one-and-done performance before the real business began. He showed up to his NBA career as someone who had already done the one thing he was most obligated to do, which gave him a kind of settled confidence that fame and money couldn't manufacture and couldn't shake. What followed over the next 19 years is the kind of career that statistical analysis struggles to fully capture, because the numbers, impressive as they are, don't convey the texture of what he actually built. 5 championships, 2 MVP awards, 3 Finals MVP titles, 15 All-Star selections. The foundation of a Spurs dynasty that became the most consistent winning organization in professional basketball across 2 decades. Built not on superstar ego and individual brilliance, but on a collective philosophy of team-first basketball that Duncan personally embodied from the first day of training camp to the last game of every season. Manu Ginobili, who played alongside him for over a decade, described Duncan's leadership as being entirely about doing rather than talking. When the team was struggling, Duncan didn't call meetings or deliver speeches. He showed up earlier than everyone else and stayed later than everyone else, and the message that sent was more powerful than anything he could have said out loud. Tony Parker has spoken about him in terms of reverence that athletes typically reserve for coaches or mentors rather than peers, describing someone who would accept the harshest public criticism from Greg Popovich without visible reaction. Not because he was submissive, but because he understood that the team's culture was more important than his personal dignity in any given moment. That's an extraordinary thing to watch from the most important player on a championship roster. The guy who carries the franchise absorbing criticism in front of everyone, without flinching, specifically so that younger players understand what the standard is. No one told Tim Duncan to do that. It's just who he was. And it cost him nothing in the currency he actually cared about while earning him everything in the currency that mattered to his teammates. The $242 million in career salary was the financial reward for all of that. And by any reasonable measure, it's an enormous amount of money. The way Duncan related to that money from the beginning was entirely consistent with the person the Virgin Islands and Wake Forest and that bedside promise had built. It was a number in an account, not an identity, not a status signal, not an obligation to perform a particular kind of wealthy life for an audience that expected it. The wardrobe, the SUV, and the anti-flex aesthetic. Let's get into the specifics of how Tim Duncan actually presents himself in the world, because the details here are more interesting than they might initially seem, and they add up to something coherent once you look at them together. During his playing career, Duncan was notorious around the league for showing up to arenas in clothing that would have been unremarkable on anyone earning a modest salary. Plaid shirts, baggy jeans cut in a silhouette that suggested he had stopped paying attention to fashion sometime in the mid-1990s and found the arrangement perfectly satisfactory. Basic sneakers with no apparent concern for whether they were the current model or someone else's signature. In an era when NBA players were establishing themselves as fashion icons, and the arrival tunnel before games had become a runway moment captured by cameras and dissected by style commentators, Duncan walked in looking like he'd gotten dressed in the dark without strong feelings about the outcome. His vehicle choices followed the same logic. Not a collection of supercars, not a rotating fleet of luxury SUVs chosen for their cultural resonance, but reliable, understated transportation that got him from his house to the arena and back, without requiring maintenance that he had to think about or insurance that made an accountant nervous. The contrast with his peers was so stark that it became a defining part of his public image, which is almost certainly not what he intended, since the whole point was to have no public image beyond what happened on the basketball court. Since his 2016 retirement, the photographs that have surfaced occasionally through fan encounters show a man who has leaned even further into this aesthetic with apparent enthusiasm. Dreadlocks, faded t-shirts, the general presentation of someone who has fully released any remaining obligation to look like a celebrity and is experiencing that release as a genuine relief. One set of images from 2024 showed him shopping casually in San Antonio in a manner so removed from any conventional idea of what a Hall of Fame basketball player looks like that people who saw the photos online weren't immediately sure it was him. This is not eccentricity for its own sake, and it's not a carefully constructed anti-celebrity persona designed to generate the kind of contrarian attention that some public figures cultivate by performing simplicity. It's just a man who genuinely doesn't experience clothing or cars or visible consumption as things that tell him anything meaningful about who he is, living accordingly, and finding the result perfectly comfortable. The Star Wars, the board games, and the life nobody photographed. Here's the Tim Duncan that almost never makes it into the official narrative, and it's arguably the most revealing part of the whole story. The actual texture of how he spends his time when basketball isn't in the picture. He is, by multiple accounts from people who know him well, a genuinely devoted Star Wars fan. Not in the casual way that millions of people have a vague affection for the franchise, but in the specific, detailed, enthusiastic way that suggests someone who has spent real time with the material and finds genuine pleasure in it. He's a serious board game player, the kind who knows the rules of complex strategy games and enjoys the mental engagement of playing them properly rather than treating them as social props. He plays video games with the same unpretentious enthusiasm, spending hours on titles that interest him without apparent concern for whether this is an appropriate hobby for someone of his professional stature and financial standing. He opened a custom car shop called Blackjack Speed Shop in San Antonio, and the detail that matters most about this isn't that he owns a business, but that he shows up to it in grease-stained clothes and gets personally involved in the mechanical work. This is not a celebrity investor who attached his name to a concept and appears occasionally for photo opportunities. He's actually interested in how engines work, in the engineering logic of how mechanical components interact, in the problem-solving that goes into making something run better than it did before. The cars he's drawn to are projects, not status symbols, things to be understood and improved rather than displayed and admired. The through line across all of these interests is that they're private satisfactions rather than public performances. Star Wars fandom, board games, video games, mechanical tinkering, none of these activities have an audience built into them. None of them require external validation to deliver their reward, and none of them are particularly enhanced by celebrity. They're things Tim Duncan genuinely enjoys, pursued in the company of people he actually likes, in a city he has chosen to remain in long after any professional obligation to be there had concluded. San Antonio wasn't a franchise assignment that he endured for 19 years while planning his eventual escape to a more glamorous market. It was somewhere he built a life, and it remains that life without any apparent desire for an upgrade. The $20 million betrayal and what it revealed. Every story about someone who maintains an unusually healthy relationship with money eventually confronts the darker material that money's world generates. And Tim Duncan's story has one of the more genuinely painful versions of this confrontation. In 2015, it came out that Duncan had been defrauded by Charles Banks, his longtime financial advisor, out of more than $20 million through fraudulent investments and financial misrepresentation. The scale of the theft was staggering in absolute terms, and for most people, $20 million represents a figure so large that losing it would constitute a life-altering catastrophe requiring years to recover from both financially and psychologically. For Duncan, the financial damage was real but survivable, given the overall scale of his accumulated wealth. What wasn't survivable in the same clean way was the relational dimension of the betrayal, because Banks wasn't a distant professional operating at arm's length from Duncan's actual life. He was someone Duncan had genuinely considered a friend, a trusted figure who had been part of his inner circle for years, a person he believed was working in his interest because he had chosen to extend that belief fully and without the kind of protective skepticism that might have caught the problem sooner. When the case went to court and Banks was sentenced in 2017, Duncan delivered a statement that tells you everything about his relationship with money and with the violation he'd experienced. He said he wasn't there to get the money back. He was there because he didn't want Banks to do this to anyone else. That statement is worth sitting with for a moment, because it represents an extraordinarily clear-eyed separation between the financial harm and the moral harm, with the explicit acknowledgement that the financial piece wasn't actually what he was in court to address. He was there on principle, not on accounting. Rather than producing bitterness or a hardened cynicism toward people generally, the experience seemed to reinforce a worldview Duncan already held about the relationship between money and genuine human value. The material world, this story confirmed for him, is full of the specific kind of danger that only exists because people have agreed to treat money as the most important thing, which creates opportunities for those willing to exploit that agreement at others' expense. His response was to withdraw further from the performance of wealth, rather than to perform it more aggressively as a way of reasserting what Banks had tried to take from him. The psychology of not needing validation. Where this actually comes from. To understand why Tim Duncan relates to money and status the way he does, the psychological roots are worth examining honestly, rather than just celebrating the outcome as though it emerged from nowhere. The loss of his mother at 14, in the specific context of a promise made at her bedside, created a value hierarchy that established itself before the money, the fame, and the social pressures of elite athletics had any opportunity to shape it. He knew what actually mattered to him before the world tried to tell him what should matter to him, and that sequencing made an enormous difference. The athletes who get consumed by flex culture and lifestyle inflation almost universally describe a period of arrival. A moment when the money showed up and the social expectations surrounding it reshaped their sense of what was required of them. Duncan never had that moment because his sense of what was required of him was already fully formed and pointed in a completely different direction. His swimmer's background contributed something important here as well. Swimming is one of the most discipline-intensive athletic pursuits in existence, built around the patient repetition of technical fundamentals with results that arrive slowly and require sustained investment to maintain. Swimmers don't perform for crowds in the way that most team sport athletes do. The work happens in the water, measured in fractions of seconds, accountable only to the clock. That orientation toward process over performance, toward the private satisfaction of doing something well rather than the public recognition of being seen doing it, embedded itself in Duncan's competitive identity before basketball ever entered the picture and stayed there across 19 NBA seasons. When Manu Ginobili describes Duncan's leadership as being entirely about doing rather than talking, he's describing someone who brought a swimmer's relationship to effort into an environment where most people are performing their effort for an audience. Duncan never quite made that adjustment, and the teams around him were better for it, and the person underneath the athlete was more intact for it. He genuinely doesn't need the world to say his name. He said as much in various ways across his career, and the retirement that followed, the complete, unhesitating disappearance from public life without a farewell tour or a media strategy or a transition into broadcasting, confirmed it. Most athletes spend years preparing the public for their departure. Tim Duncan just stopped playing basketball one day and went home, and has been there ever since, apparently perfectly content. What freedom looks like when it's real. The deepest layer of Tim Duncan's story is the one that connects his individual choices to something larger about what money is actually for. And it's worth spending time with because it's the part most people miss when they reduce the whole thing to NBA legend lives simply. How refreshing. There's a category of wealthy person, genuinely common in professional sports and increasingly visible across tech and finance, who has accumulated significant money but lives in effective captivity to it. The overhead of the lifestyle they've built requires continuous high income to maintain. The social ecosystem they've constructed costs a weekly fortune to sustain. The public image they've invested in needs constant maintenance and occasional expensive repair. They have a lot of money, and almost none of the freedom that money was supposed to buy because every dollar that came in went straight back out into the infrastructure of looking like someone with a lot of money. Tim Duncan bought actual freedom in the same specific way that Chad Johnson bought actual freedom. And freedom looks exactly like what his life looks like. A man who decides each day what he wants to do, does it, and owes that decision to nobody. He works on cars because he finds it genuinely satisfying. He plays board games with people he likes. He watches Star Wars movies with his kids. He goes to the grocery store in San Antonio and checks the prices without any particular self-consciousness about whether this is an appropriate activity for someone of his stature, because the concept of appropriate activities for someone of his stature simply doesn't feature in how he thinks about his own life. His net worth is estimated at over $200 million. The overhead of his actual daily existence is negligible by comparison, which means that figure will sustain his life and his children's lives and their children's lives without requiring him to do a single thing he doesn't want to do from this point forward. That's not an accident. That's the result of 2 decades of refusing to build a lifestyle that consumed what he earned as fast as it arrived. And the freedom it purchased is the kind that can't be replicated by any car or watch or real estate portfolio because it's structural rather than decorative. He was betrayed for $20 million and went to court on principle rather than to recover the money. He walked away from a 19-season career without a farewell tour because he had nothing left to prove and no interest in performing the ending. He lives in the same city he played in a life quiet enough that photos of him shopping occasionally go viral because people are genuinely surprised he looks that ordinary, and his response to that surprise, to the extent that he has one, is probably to find it faintly amusing and go back to whatever he was doing. The highest form of luxury, as Tim Duncan has lived it without ever quite articulating it this way, is the complete absence of anything you're obligated to perform. No status to maintain, no image to protect, no lifestyle to fund, no audience to satisfy. Just a life, lived on its own terms, in a city he chose, with the people he loves, doing things that genuinely interest him. 5 championship rings, $250 million earned, and nothing left to prove to anyone. That's not a man who lives like a poor man. That's a man who lives like someone who figured out what money is actually for and has been quietly enjoying the answer ever since. If that kind of story is what keeps you coming back, subscribe to Black Status and we'll keep bringing it. See you in the next one.